give our undivided attention to Paul. Paul's been in politics for 45 years, I'm going to say. 45 years. 48. What makes you sound younger?
Okay.
All right, you guys. You guys, let's hear it for Paul Glumaz.
So, first I want to pass out what I did is I prepared this presentation and then I decided to write the notes for it. So people that will have notes to refer to afterwards. And then I have a timeline, scribbled timeline at the back. So let's go ahead. Why don't we hang these out?
Yeah, we'll hang these out.
Okay.
Okay. And there will be a test.
But these are just my notes. And then at a certain point I'll be talking briefly about this book called The Modern Anglo-Dutch Empire. And if you want to purchase it, it's excellent. It's $15. That's what it cost me to get them here. Okay. So.
Interesting title. Interesting title.
Okay. So, I'll start. So I became active with Lyndon LaRouche in 1974, 48 years ago. And we were sort of on the left. We were kind of one of the leftist groups, the Marxist groups, whatever you want to call them. But nothing made any sense. And this whole thing of communism versus capitalism didn't make any sense because that's the way the world worked back then. You either were a communist or socialist, or you were pro-free market, whatever. And so in 1974, Mr. LaRouche asked us all to start researching to try to figure out what the hell is really going on with history. What the hell is all this all about? Why are all these things happening? How can the United States become an industrial nation? How did the United States become an industrial nation? How did many things happen in the world? And after 4 years of a lot of people doing a lot of research and Mr. LaRouche looking into the research and discussing it, he wrote something called The Secrets Known Only to the Inner Elites. And I can't give you the, this is the, just we can pass this around. That was the original look of the pamphlet, which was 44 years ago. Okay, so since this 1978 document, which is quite extensive, is the first attempt at trying to understand history, politics, science, etc., from the standpoint of not the narratives that you hear about, but from actually how it actually works. How does it actually work? If you were to read the article today, there's a lot of content that since then has been discovered to not be right on. So it's kind of confusing if you read it today. However, the ideas in it and the very conceptions of it and the basic idea of it is absolutely the best I've seen, and it's truthful. So I'll start with an overview. In the last 3,000 years of Mediterranean-centered civilization, which includes us, because we're all coming out of that Greek, Mediterranean, Egyptian, Mesopotamian civilization, there have been two factions, contending factions with totally different views on the nature of humanity, what is the purpose of society and government. And these two factions have been at war with each other, and they have an elite, they are elites. Within them are elites. One faction can be called the civilization city builder faction, which later in the European Renaissance was called the humanist faction. That's not to be confused with current definition of humanism. The other can be called the anti-civilization, oligarchical, human beings are property faction, or the zero growth faction. And these two factions, in the grand scheme of history, represent two totally different intentions, and all major conflicts in history are a product of their efforts to implement their worldviews. These two factions have internal secret knowledge, which really is not secret, but it's not available to people directly, and methods from which they seek to advance their orientation. Philosophically, one is based on the Socratic dialogue, as is developed in the Plato's dialogues, and the other is based on Aristotle. And these two are very different philosophical worldviews. They're not commensurate to one another. Aristotle is not the student of Plato, and so forth and so on. That's a total lie. That's a total fraud. Okay, and I'll get into that. I personally identify in attempting to continue the civilization city builder faction in the modern period. That's how I personally identify myself. And through this understanding, I have located my identity in that. And we are entering a critical period about whether we're going to continue to have civilization or not. Now, these elite factions have a continuity. That is, they knew who their predecessors were. They operated off of the work of their predecessors. And they knew that was the issue, that was the issue. And of course, up until modern times, most people weren't literate, and most people were not part of this, although they were influenced by this fight. They were not necessarily conscious of the two factions, but the two factions were conscious of each other, and they were conscious of what they represented and where they go. However, between 1784 and 1818, the city builder faction began to be scattered and lost its continuity, having scattered remnants, and became scattered remnants, not really knowing where their residual pro-civilization views came from. So that's the overview. Now I'll go into what's the not so secret knowledge. Okay. Okay. So each faction has a different approach to knowledge, and has a different approach to human beings and the deployment of that knowledge. So we'll start with the lowest level of knowledge, which is belief. And beliefs are based on basically sense experience, prejudice, and mythologies. These are beliefs. And these are the shadows, essentially, that in Plato's cave analogy. In Plato's cave analogy, where you're watching the shadows, you think that's reality, but it's not. And however, from the standpoint of the no-growth faction, the Aristotelian faction, the oligarchical faction, these are useful to control people. And to that end, the Aristotelians have developed capabilities for creating mythologies, or for undermining other views to turn them into something that they could use to control people. They also have used this approach to create cults. And for that purpose, they seek above all else to protect their creations from the discovery of their falsehoods. In other words, their primary function is to create a false religion or a false mythology or a cult or whatever, and then try to protect it from being uncovered for what it really is. The Platonic faction, instead, wants to move people out of the shadows, or at least provide better mythologies that can advance civilization. That's what the city builder faction, associated with the Platonic dialogues, is committed to doing. Now we come to the second level of knowledge, which is understanding. This is based on a somewhat provable or apparently provable body that is available to the so-called more educated. The Platonic view is that this knowledge is also faulty. The Aristotelian view is that this knowledge too needs to be controlled. That is, the body of so-called knowledge that you accept as reality, that has some appearance of validity in terms of proof, is what they're trying to control. Now we come to the third level of knowledge, which is called reason, but it's not as people understand reason today. We call it Platonic reason. And this is based on the individual examining their consciousness in terms of the way their consciousness is mirrored in the thinking of another person within a Socratic dialogue. This mirroring is to make one's consciousness an object or subject of one's own willful consciousness. That is, to be willfully conscious of one's consciousness. Not just to discover what is in error, but more importantly, how and why one previously accepted the error as valid. This method involves in the dialogue process negation of existing knowledge, which then clears the path for new discoveries and new knowledge. So new knowledge which supersedes the old knowledge. Everything taught in universities today about Plato and the Platonic dialogue is fraudulent mythology created by Aristotelian scholars centered in places like Cambridge and Oxford. That's the key in the modern period. It's the Cambridge and Oxford classical scholars. The Aristotelian faction knows this level of knowledge exists, and it tries to promote the view that discoveries of new knowledge cannot occur by a knowable process and is accidental. Even more important, the Aristotelian faction seeks above all else to suppress the knowledge of how Platonic reason is generated. The Platonic faction requires the movement of the population out of the shadows, beyond the mere level of belief, to knowledge and ultimately Platonic reason if civilization is to develop, cities to be built, an economy to grow, trade to grow, living standards to rise, etc. That's a precondition. You have to move people out of the condition of superstition and mythologies and just sense certainty if you're going to get them to become more developed, to be able to have development. Whereas the Aristotelian faction instead wants a fixed society with a few overlords, not to be disturbed by the development of their subjects and property. They want and have always wanted a fixed zero growth society. That goes all the way back. It's not new. It goes all the way back. And that's their utopia. And that's what we're dealing with today. Now, the reason Aristotle is used is that Aristotle rejects the knowability of Platonic reason by establishing that all knowledge comes from sense certainty. That from sense certainty comes memory of experience, which leads to ideas. Indoctrinating students in Aristotle and his categories is essential to stultify their ability to discover new knowledge, as well as the relative falseness of old knowledge, including the falseness of the mythologies used to govern population. The Aristotelian faction is based on falsification of the history of ideas, science, and the causes behind historical conflicts. In the last century and a half, the big falsification of philosophical history is that Aristotle is the follower and student of Plato, and that Plato was an idealist and Aristotle was a materialist, and this is all BS. This and other falsifications about the fact that Plato and Aristotle were factional and philosophical enemies is the work of the most important controlling part of the globalist elite, the empire-centered classicist scholars at Oxford and Cambridge. So this is where the actual highest level of control exists over the translation of classical documents and over the translation of ancient documents, which are mistranslated, okay, and this is done on purpose, and it involves, most importantly, as I said, falsifying and mistranslating for current truth seekers the classics and ancient texts. A further example of falsifying history is to place the philosopher, this is a modern one, to face the philosopher John Locke, the fiercest advocate of slavery in the New World, as the founder of the philosophy of the founding fathers of the U.S. Rather, it was Locke's factional enemies, Leibniz and Leibniz's follower Benjamin Franklin, who were the philosophical and scientific founders of this country. So John Locke, if you think John Locke is the founder of this country, you have lost. You're lost. You're gone. Okay, that's how it works. That's how they control. So the second method of the Aristotelians is the creation of mythologies, including the mythologies behind creating cults. You have the cult of Apollo of Delphi, the Mithra cult of the Roman legions, the various cults of this, and most significant for our day, the Phrygian cult of Dionysius. Today's satanic cults come out of the Phrygian cult of Dionysius, as does environmentalism, Maoism, Jacobinism of the French Revolution, anarchist purgative violence cults, the rock, drug, sex counterculture, and current and past mass formations of popular fascism. This is where the people get all excited and they go on a battering ram against the enemies of the Aristotelians. Okay, so, and this is also an approach taken in religious wars to get the violence between. You have different religions, you have different factions of religions, you have different interpretations of the Bible, and what you want to do is have some kind of violence between the two and keep it going. So, and of course I'm going to leave some time for questions, so let me give you some historical examples of the conflict between the two. The first one is Alexander the Great. Now this was the final showdown between the two factions in that part of the world around the 3rd century BC. And one faction was promoting the problem for the zero growth faction, the oligarchical faction, was that the Greek city-states were involved in knowledge and trade and development and so forth and so on, and they couldn't suppress them. They couldn't stop them. And Plato in this period was very much involved in organizing various parts of the Greek world into a kind of city-state that was promoting development. And he spent 10 years in Syracuse trying to do this. And he had an academy, a Platonic academy. A Platonic academy was not just a school; it was a center of intelligence and deployment in that part of the world. For getting these for disseminating the Platonic Socratic dialogues, and so the Persian and other oligarchies connected to the Persian came up with this view of using Philip of Macedon, who was Alexander's father, to create an empire in the west, and then the Persians would have an empire in the east, and these two would be in constant conflict, in controlled conflict, and that controlled conflict would give them the power to suppress the population of both regions. However, Philip was murdered, and that's another issue, but he was murdered unexpectedly, and Alexander came in and decided to change all of that. And so before they could get to him, he had his armies crossing into the Persian area, and he crushed the Persians, but his intention was not to set up an empire, a double empire, but to actually start a massive development program for the entire region, including Egypt. But he was assassinated or poisoned, and the networks that poisoned him were very closely associated with Aristotle, and he was being advised by people from the Platonic Academy. So this was a direct confrontation between the two, and this led to a situation eventually, and this is going over a lot of period of history. This led to the ultimate dominance of the Aristotelian faction till the advent of the Platonic current in Christianity around St. Paul, and later St. Augustine. So you're looking at and it doesn't really surface in terms of a genuine Renaissance until the Baghdad Caliphate and the Platonic and Charlemagne. Charlemagne was being advised by Alcuin of York, who was part of the networks that come out of Ireland, which were part of the networks that St. Augustine escaped the fall of the Roman Empire to Spain and into Ireland. So this is known to all. This was known to the Platonic faction as part of their basic knowledge. That this is how. But however, the Aristotelian global oligarchical faction returned in the Middle Ages around 10,000 AD. With the emergence of the financial empire of Venice, which is sort of the model for our modern empire, plunder. And this was coupled with the victory of a grouping of European aristocracy centered around the Guelph against Frederick of Barbarossa, and it led to who was a city builder, and led to the emergence of the Guelph faction, which dominates the European aristocratic oligarchical elite to this day. The key was this guy by the name of Hildebrand, who became Pope Gregory VII, who launched the Crusades and the Inquisition. So how did they use to take control? They launched the Inquisition and the Crusades, and the crusading armies and the debt created by that. This is similar to what we're dealing with today. It's a similar model. And philosophically, in this period, the Aristotelian faction took over the Catholic Church completely, known as the Scholastics, and weren't defeated until the Renaissance in the 1400s. But then they came back in the 15 and 1600s. So then the emergence of the Renaissance around the teaching order of the late 1300s, early 1400s, called the Brotherhood of Common Life. If you pick up a book by Thomas à Kempis in The Imitation of Christ, that's kind of where they were coming from. That comes out of that teaching order. And what they did is they went into looking for the brilliant young commoners, and they educated them, and they became they had a Socratic, a Platonic approach, and that Cusa was one of those towering figures that came out of that. Nicholas of Cusa, who you can't read about anymore, and he profoundly crushed the Aristotelian viewpoint through philosophical and of course it was religious too, and theological discourse, and then you had at the same time the emergence of the Renaissance and an incredible burst of scientific discoveries that led to the formation of new political institutions like the modern sovereign nation state of today. Actually has its origins in the 1400s under Francis Louis XI and England's Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor Renaissance. And also you have to understand that during this period, the work of Plato and Socrates and the Platonic faction became accessible for the first time through the Islamic world, and then through the Greek, Byzantine Paleologs, who were also at the end of the Byzantine Empire. The Paleologs were a city building faction. So this Renaissance really shook everything up. Out of that came Da Vinci. Out of that came Brunelleschi, the incredible scientific work, and the development of the nation, because the nation itself, as understood out of the Renaissance, starting with Dante, which was a lot earlier, but later Cusa, it's the Renaissance. The idea of the nation is the nation doesn't exist for the king or the lords. The nation exists as common to everyone. And that concept of the sovereign nation state is the first, because Charlemagne was based on the Holy Roman Empire concept of the city of God of St. Augustine. This was a much more advanced concept of a nation state, and it was also understood that in order to make it work, you had to create a modern vernacular language, not just exist in Latin. So these people were promoting the creation, like Dante and many others were promoting the creation of a modern vernacular language, so the average plebeian, the average peasant could have a means to communicate, universally communicate, and also writing. They began promoting writing. So that was going on then, and the oligarchical faction countered by splitting the church, creating the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, the religious war, which lasted a century and a half, like today, and the creation of new form of Aristotelianism, because the old scholastic form of Aristotelianism didn't really work, on the basis of William of Ockham, developed by a Venetian Servite monk and atheist by the name of Paolo Sarpi, based out of Venice. This was spread throughout Venetian intelligence networks and became the basis of the modern Enlightenment. liberalism, empiricism, everything that's come out of that, logical positivism, etc. Karl Marx as well as Adam Smith. This is the philosophical foundation and conceptual technology of today's modern globalist empire, otherwise called the modern Anglo-Dutch Empire. And that's what this book is about. It's a full discussion of this, very in-depth discussion of that whole process. So we're dominated by this Enlightenment empiricist worldview, which this book goes into, and this is what we're dealing with. Now, to explain the difference between the Renaissance Platonic view and the modern Enlightenment view is centered on the question of scientific method of discovery. In the empirical form of the Enlightenment, the method of that is its method of science, the method of how a discovery is made is considered metaphysical and is outlawed from discussion. In other words, you can't discuss the process by which you come to a discovery, which is what you have to do at the highest level of Platonic reason. You can't discuss how you did that because that's metaphysical and it's not scientific. And that's how science is controlled today. It's controlled by that approach. So you get stuck in a situation where when you try to present something based on Platonic reason where things don't agree and you have to come up with a different hypothesis, you get slapped down by saying you're not being empirical. You're not being empirical. You're not being empirical. And that goes on and on and on. So this is what you're dealing with. So in the Renaissance and in the Platonic approach, the method of how you discover is made, as in the works of Kepler. And Kepler's works on astronomy goes through intensively how he came to the discovery. He takes the individual reader through the entire process from beginning to end. Where he went wrong, how he changed his mind, what happened. So you're actually reflecting Kepler's own reflection on his entire process of discovery. And he made the discoveries, not anybody else. And so in the Renaissance, in the Platonic view, in the Renaissance view, understanding how you arrived at that conception is the most important part, even more important than the discovery itself. So, going to the modern period, the Platonic element has been broken up, and you see fragments of it in different places and in different people who have a sense of being an American or have a sense of what our country represents. It's a very faint sense of what it was, of the highest level of intellect that created the republic. But it still is a residue in the population. It still exists in the population, and that's where we are now. Okay, so it's this question of trying to uncover how history really works and why they're doing all this crazy shit, right? I mean, it's they want to forever eliminate this from the earth so that there can be no progress. Everything from transhumanism to you name it is so that they can eliminate this ability of the human being to use the Socratic dialogue. Now, the Socratic dialogue is not dialectics. That has nothing. Dialectics has totally nothing to do with the Socratic dialogue. It's a dialogue. It's not, A meets B and they conflict and then you get C. It has nothing to do with that. It's not a synthesis. It's a discovery. And I'm in the last few years of my life, I intend to help revive that. Now I see shreds of this in different parts of the world and in different. I even see some of it in Trump when he gave that speech at the World Economic Forum, where he brought up Florence and the Renaissance, and he told these people they were completely insane and they were apocalyptic, and so on and so forth. It's a very unusual speech for him to make because it was on a much more higher philosophical level than what you ever hear him say. But that's a reflection. It's a reflection of this of this builder faction. Of course, Trump is a builder, but that's not the point. The point is that there's a reflection of this going on as we enter this crisis. And keep in mind that it's always in a crisis like this, like the collapse of Europe in the 1300s, where forces emerge that want to change it, and that's where they rediscover this approach. So, but we're very far away from actually reviving the city builder faction philosophically at this time, but hopefully as things develop, we will be able to do that. So I'll stop there.
Wow. Thank you, Paul. That actually explains a lot. But I'm sure we have questions. I've got questions, but does anyone want to go first? Well, Paul. Yeah, Ida.
Who are the Khazarians?
Who are the Khazarians? The Khazarians, the Russian Khazarians, the Kardashians.
Okay, so this gets into the whole Jewish issue. Okay, that's one of the biggest rabbit holes in the world, and I'll get to that. The other biggest rabbit holes is the communism versus capitalism thing, you know. You have different currents in Judaism. You have a Renaissance or a city builder current in Judaism that comes out of Islam. Actually, the Islamic Renaissance in Baghdad and Spain later on, Andalusia and in Spain, actually revived the Platonic current inside Judaism that comes out of the Alexander the Great period. So that's largely a Sephardic Jewish component. And then you have the grouping of people that converted to Judaism in the part of Europe that used to be called Khazaria. And the way it works is this. The Jews are an outsider group. So what the oligarchy does is they don't want to do everything in their name. They bring in an outsider, people from the outside that they can get rid of to do the dirty work, like George Soros or somebody like that. So they typically, because usury was not allowed in medieval Europe, they typically would use Jews to do the banking and to do the various different things. But then when they got too powerful, they would confiscate their wealth. And this is the essence of the play by Marlowe called The Jew of Malta, where this big, powerful banker became too big. And then the oligarchy said, well, you're conducting usury, we're going to confiscate everything. But the Jewish conspiracy is another one of those mythological creations with some basis in terms of personnel being used. There's many others like this. And you know that because you've actually examined it and you've actually seen where the power actually comes from. It doesn't come from there. These are appendages to the power, like the Rothschilds and so forth and so on. They're appendages to this. Who is the power? The power is a multiply nested grouping of aristocrats, primarily based in Europe, with family histories going back to probably the period when they emerged as a dominant power in the 1100s. And they don't go out front and do anything. They are there. They have the power of the given to them by the fact that everyone else is controlled by mythologies. Everyone else is controlled by mythologies. That's their power. Their power is there.
That's amazing.
What is Talaman rule?
What?
It's called Talaman rule, kind of a Jewish thing.
Oh, Talmudic.
Yeah.
Oh.
That gets out of my area of
Yeah.
expertise.
Oh.
Okay, Paul, you mentioned the that kind of feeling of being American and what's the vestiges of that. Can you talk more about that and also what it means to be a city builder, because we have so many negative role models around us. We need to know more about what's a positive. What are the ideals?
Okay. Beethoven wrote his Ninth Symphony, and the final movement is the chorale. And It's about Benjamin Franklin.
Huh.
Okay. At the time that Benjamin Franklin was alive, he was the recognized leader and successor of this entire, what we used to call humanist movement, okay, as well as the scientific movements of the whole thing. He inherited the whole thing on a global basis. And his project, as was bequeathed to him by his predecessors, was to create a unique nation based upon the principles of the freedom of individuals. Because why do you want freedom? So you can develop. Based on that, and he was hoping to be able to do that and then leverage that into having the entire English-speaking world become that. But when that failed, then he began organizing for the independence. The independence from Great Britain was not organized from the standpoint of we're being oppressed, but from the standpoint of those who came into power the British East India Company's power became overwhelmingly dominant in 1763, and it's at that point that it became obvious to Franklin that there was no hope for the colonies other than independence. Otherwise, he was using the colonies to try to change Great Britain. Now, Great Britain was where you had your first industrial development, but people don't know that Franklin was oversaw the whole development of the steam engine. James Watt was part of the Wilkinson operation, which was overseen by Franklin when he was in, and he was collaborating with scientific networks in Great Britain. So he had this idea in mind, and the idea that they had, which was not his original, it goes back earlier to Leibniz and before, is that this is very important, is that there's a limit to what you can do economically with animal power and human power and maybe some windmills and some falls to grind stuff with. There's a limit to what you can create. You need to have you need to have machines replace human beings and do the work of many human beings. And to do that, you had to have a form of power that they knew had to be used. And so that's what the ideal was. The ideal was to use some kind of heat power to generate activity in machines that could increase the
Do work.
increase the amount of work that could be done with the minimum amount of people. So that was the Industrial Revolution, and it was something that was being discussed and promoted, starting with people like Da Vinci, who developed a lot of the technology for it, a lot of the designs for it. So that's what the so-called humanist faction, city builder faction represented. They represented this idea that human beings, from a theological standpoint, are co-creators with the Creator, and that they're there to develop further the universe that God created in conjunction with God. And that's the philosophical viewpoint that exists in that viewpoint, and not this other viewpoint of suppressing everything and looting the hell out of everything and controlling everything.
That's cool. So okay, Paul, but just a quick follow-up. So in the very modern day right now, where we're being offered to join the COVID-19 cult, they're making a pretty compelling case for that with, what's to follow, like transhumanism and stuff. But what is our option to that? Like, how do we stay grounded in reality?
Okay, is to make sure that the revolt of the people against this and the institution of the nation, which still exists as a bequeathment from this Renaissance, be used as a vehicle to crush these people.
Like America, what you were talking about.
Whether it's in America or by influence from the earlier America.
Yeah.
In other nations, the institution of the nation state. That's why they've been trying to get rid of nations, totally.
Okay.
Because in a crisis, people rally around the nation, and the nation acts to defend the nation, not to defend an oligarch.
Yeah.
So it's the institution of the nation, or what's left of the vestiges of nationhood, activated by the revolt of the population, which it doesn't go crazy, but goes for a set of policies. And that's why we're calling for the Federal Reserve to be taken down, because that takes down them. set up a national bank that creates sovereign credit, and so we restore power of the nation over its development, over its future. And then you have nations like the United States working with Russia on shutting down the drug trade. You have all kinds of, once nations start to cooperate in their own interest, which is, by the way, Trump was saying stuff like this. Once nations start to cooperate in their own interest, then this oligarchy will be destroyed.
Okay.
And that's, but the problem is the philosophical basis for all this is still very weak in the minds of the people that were going to be doing this.
Yeah. But it could start with us.
Yes.
Starts with
Okay.
us. Okay, who's
But
next?
Paul, just one more question. You know, you think getting rid of the Federal Reserve, you know, I'm in agreement with that. But in order to do that, wouldn't we have to have something like a Russian Revolution where millions of people died to bring about the end of the Tsar? I mean, we're still living in this for 100 years later.
The history of central banking starts with Venice. That's what this is all about.
You know?
And the enemy of this is the nation state. And you can restore sovereignty over the nation, and that's one part of it. And that can be done. We have the power to do that as in our history and in our Constitution. We probably have a better sense of we probably have a better capability of doing that than other nations. And we have potential allies. We have potential allies in other nations who will respond because they're in a cage too. They're in the same cage that we are. They will respond to the United States coming out of the cage, and they will respond to the United States. They will respond. Believe, I'm going to tell you something. The very fact that Trump said those kind of things at the United Nations made him the most popular American in the history of Africa.
Wow.
People don't know this.
I didn't know that.
There were demonstrations all over the world in Africa in support of Trump. People don't know this.
If I can add something really quick, what we might be seeing is basically the natural end of the Federal Reserve, because it started as a Ponzi scheme and it would play out, and so that economy is
It's playing out now.
popping. Yeah, it is. So
Exactly.
do we run to the next one, or do we actually kind of just let's not sign up for the next?
But a collapse of a regime generally can bring in a lot of terrible, terrible things.
Absolutely, and we want to avoid it.
Well, yeah,
But I have to
exactly.
ask, I mean, you guys are talking about getting rid of the central bank, but do you know what a central bank does? Do you know what it is?
Oh, hold on. Let me hit the question over
Yeah,
here.
So, were you gonna get some water? I was wondering if you need some water.
Do you get some water, Paul?
That wasn't my question.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, thank you.
Go ahead.
So I'm a big fan of Plato's Allegory of the Cave, and
Okay.
I try to read and reread it. And I was really interested that you said that Aristotle and Plato seem like they're polar opposites, because I believed the lie. What you said was a lie, that Aristotle was Plato's
Yeah.
student. But what association did they have?
They were enemies.
Really?
Okay.
Aristotle was deploying against Plato or the Platonic Academy. Totally.
Wow.
I mean, like war. I mean, like assassination type level war.
Okay, so when Socrates was killed, he chose that he could have been exiled. Was Aristotle against him, or was
Aristotle wasn't on the scene.
Wasn't alive.
Aristotle wasn't on the scene. Plato was a very young man at the time. Plato lived to be 80, so that means, or 70 to 80. So we're talking another 50 years, 40 years. Another 50 years. We're talking another 50 years after Socrates' death. Another
Okay.
50, 60 years after Socrates' death.
Was Aristotle?
And then Aristotle is a lot younger than Plato, but he exists in the same time frame for a while. And then,
Yeah.
then Plato has left behind an academy, and that's the continuation of Plato.
And then you said, Oxford, Cambridge has made everything that Plato's written a lie.
Aristotle.
The way that they are.
They don't make it a lie. Okay, I'll give you an example.
And let me finish
Yeah,
the
okay.
question. I'm reading the English translation of it, and it seems like it's pretty right on. Are some of the English translations inaccurate as well?
In very small but crucial conceptual ways.
Kind of like the Bible.
In other words, if a Greek talks about air as being an essential ingredient. The Cambridge scholar will call it air, in the sense of the air that you have. But what the Greek meant was spirit. So you don't know that that's what he's talking about. You see that kind of subtle change, which is very sophisticated. Jowett is one of the most famous translators of Plato, and we found a number of Greek people found a number of key things like that, where the concept, the idea could not be communicated that was really meant by the dialogue because of that.
So who's the most accurate translator of Plato?
It's the best ones would go back to the period before, a much earlier period, and I would have to research that. But if I'll find out if you want to leave me your email.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Can I bring up just one thing, and then to contrast and compare? Like, I've been hearing now about China rolling out their social credit system based on behavior as a means to control the population. So if they behave in a certain way, they get rewarded. If they don't, they're punished through a social credit system. Now, could it possibly play into the United States with, like, there will be no more cash, you will have financial reward to live, to eat, to travel on a social credit type system? Do you see something like that as a means of the
All right.
elite controlling the people?
Okay.
It's a scary
Okay.
scenario here, I
The-
know, but
okay.
it's.
The problem with China, the biggest problem with China, I'm gonna be blunt, is the culture. And the second biggest problem with China is Maoism, is what happened under Mao. Okay, the problem with the Chinese culture is practicality. You can't have a metaphysical discussion with them because they will ask you, what good is this metaphysical discussion going to do? How much money am I going to make from what you're telling me? I'm serious. Let me tell you, I spent 200 hours talking to the leader of a Chinese community, the leader of the Chinese community of Canada. So I have a sense of this, okay? Now, the opposite culturally to them is the Russian culture, where everything is metaphysical. What's behind this? What's behind that? How does this work? How does that work? The culture of Russia, for reasons I don't understand, they're the most metaphysical in terms of dialogue among the educated people in culture. I don't mean metaphysics in some kind of occult sense. I mean, what's the metaphysics behind what's going on? And the last great scientist of that tradition was Vernadsky, and he was the one person that was spared by Stalin because he was behind the atom bomb and a lot of other things. But anyhow, to make a long story short, so now the Chinese problem is one problem. The second problem is Maoism. Maoism is not indigenous to China. The philosophical basis of Maoism is pure Aristotle. It's pure Aristotle coming from Marxism and Leninism, which is pure Aristotle.
Yeah.
So what he did is he said, well, we're not just here, developing China is not the issue. The issue is to prevent a managerial elite or a managerial class of intellectuals from emerging. So we're going to have a cultural revolution. And finally that brought China to almost total collapse. In that period, Kissinger started opening up China. And you have to understand, so when Deng Xiaoping finally took complete control or became the leader around 78, China wanted to modernize and industrialize. But they ended up in a conflict with the Soviet Union. They ended up in a conflict with the Soviet Union in that period, in the period of Mao and seceding. So here's the point. China is a civilization, but it's also a nation. It has a culture, but that culture was pretty much damaged by the Maoist Cultural Revolution. However, there was an attempt to revive that culture. It's complicated. All right. So on the one hand, they don't want to be conquered by the oligarchs of the West. So that makes them an opponent. On the other hand, they are in a partnership with the West
That's true.
in the economic sense.
Yeah.
And the idea of the Belt and Road, which was originally proposed by my group at that time, could only work if the Chinese agreed to break with this system and go with a national system for all nations. Because you can't have because the Belt and Road was the development of the railroad and other transportation corridors to connect the world and break the power of the empire over the seas. However, it doesn't work in the context of this globalized system. Now, the Chinese took advantage of the dollar as a global currency, but they maintain a restriction on the ability for the globalists to come in and take over their country, and so forth. So it's a very complicated situation. So if I were president, or I would assume that Trump would try to do something similar if he were president, I would go to the Chinese and say, because they're very practical, say, we got a better deal for you. And then we would say, you're going to produce for yourself, we're going to produce for ourselves, we're going to do well, we're going to help you, you're going to help us, period. And the Chinese would, if the Chinese saw this as a viable possibility, they wouldn't support it and try to promote it, because they're not like that. If they saw that as a viable reality, they would go along with it. But if they don't see that as a viable reality, then it's love and hate in the same kind of in the same thing. It's a very now, in dealing with the Chinese, the biggest philosophical problem they have about the West is they don't understand the European Renaissance. And thereby they don't understand what America is.
Yeah.
They only see it through the light of the Enlightenment, which is what they experienced from the Europeans. And every effort I've tried to get the Chinese to understand this, I've had a very hard time.
Very interesting. Huh.
Wow, thank you.
Aren't they a little pissed off about the opium wars as well?
Yeah, and also pissed off over what happened. So you also have to understand that the Chinese are coming into their own. They were a major civilization along with India. They were the two major civilizations before the rise of European colonialism, and they're now coming back to their primacy, and they screwed themselves with this one-child policy and a lot of other things. Now, internally, China has a problem because they have a communist party system. And they have about 97,000 members in the Communist Party. It's not like a small party. But if you want to be part of what's going on, you get into the Communist Party. Now, that doesn't mean they're all the same. There's a vast factional wars going on. But it's under the table. So you have that problem. So the problem is that the wars going on within the Communist Party are knowledgeable to British intelligence, but they're not knowledgeable to us. And British intelligence knows how to manipulate those things. The famous case of Bohi Lai, who was expected to be the potential big guy. He was a princeling. So he started cracking down on corruption. He became a big star. And his wife was involved in funneling money out of the country, which all the elites do, and she ended up poisoning her British intelligence manager of her money, and it all broke down. But it was a factional fight. It was a factional fight within the Communist Party. So you have those kind of things. So now the problem of their people, okay, and they're going to have this problem. The more advanced economically they become and the more prosperous they become, people are going to want more than just material substances, and they're going to want something else, and they don't have that to give them directly, and so they're going to have a problem. So the Communist Party is now going to try to control people It created a social credit score, but it's different in a communist country like that. The social credit score is not like it is here. It's, you know, the leader is the father, you know, and so on and so forth. It's not the same. But here, it's a total anathema. It's a total violation of the most fundamental principle of our nation.
You know,
So.
They don't have that tradition.
You
Yeah.
guys, we're gonna wrap up, but one more question, Tom.
You said some fairly, what sounded like positive things about Trump. A couple things I'm curious about is why does it seem like he is on board with the whole COVID-19, the masks, the shots, and the boosters? He even said, you know, he said, yes, I've been boosted, and I'm telling everybody else to be boosted. And then also the January 6th people, it seems like he's really pulling punches. Is he kind of handcuffed, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think it
Well,
is-
I don't know the story on the COVID matter. I myself thought it was a great thing at the time when it came off. I think it's I think I got duped. You know, and I think a lot of people got duped, and he was under tremendous political pressure because he saw the vaccinations as a political.
But now there's so much information out there.
Right, and I haven't seen him yet.
I think his information sources are pretty limited.
Haven't seen him yet make the shift, but I would expect that he would have to at some
You
point.
guys, we're gonna wrap up. Feel free to talk to Paul afterwards, but I do have one more question, Paul. Could you talk a bit about the book?
Okay.
And why people should pick up a copy?
Okay, this book is incredibly well researched. It combines the philosophical battle coming out of the Renaissance, and it gives you a profound view of what you're up against from the standpoint of what I presented, and he goes through the networks that were deployed,
It's the Dutch.
and it's not Dutch or English. It's actually comes out of Venice, but it goes north into Netherlands and into
They call them Merovingians, right?
Huh?
Isn't it Merovingians, basically?
I don't.
Merovingian
No,
dynasties?
Yeah, that's
It's.
The Pharaohs.
Huh?
The Pharaohs?
No. It's a system. It's a system of banking and government.
The black
The black nobility, yeah. The black nobility is sort of the underlying dominant faction of the oligarchy in Europe.
Okay.
And it's what the House of Windsor is all about. It's what all these people are about.
Okay.
And they, but they're not in. The House of Windsor is at the center of the COVID thing through Princess Anne and the health and the Eco Health Alliance, and they're the center of the climate change business.
You do know that the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha family, they're actually a Dutch banking house.
Come again?
They are the Saxe-Coburg-Gathas, they are
Yeah,
a
yeah,
Dutch
yeah.
banking
yeah,
house,
yeah,
yeah.
It's the same.
You guys?
They renamed themselves.
You guys, let's give a big round of applause for Paul. And we'll be here till 9, so feel free to ask questions or talk amongst yourself.
Sure.
Now you can make noise and stuff. Go ahead and turn